Dr. Alex Reed stared out the helicopter window at the dilapidated facility below. The research center, once a hub of scientific progress, now lay in ruins. Its walls were cracked, and the roof sagged ominously. The unsettling silence of the place was broken only by the soft hum of the helicopter's rotors. As the helicopter descended, an eerie glow from the facility's flickering lights cast long shadows across the courtyard. The pilot, a stern-faced man with tired eyes, turned to Reed. "We're here, Doc. Be careful down there. Something's not right." Reed nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He grabbed his bag and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, the unnerving sensation of being watched creeping over him. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was worse. The corridors were dimly lit, and the silence was almost tangible. Reed's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the control room. He passed by rooms with broken glass and overturned furniture, signs of a struggle everywhere. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Finally, he reached the control room. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a disconcerting discovery. Monitors displayed static, and papers were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room lay a body, a scientist judging by the lab coat. Reed's heart pounded as he approached, noting the unnatural stillness of the corpse. He crouched down, examining the body. There were no signs of injury, but the pale, clammy skin and vacant eyes suggested something far more sinister. Reed's mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. A sudden noise broke the silence, making Reed jump. He turned to see a man standing in the doorway, his face gaunt and eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Reed asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Dr. Myers," the man replied, his voice trembling. "You're Dr. Reed, right? Thank God you're here. We need to leave now. It's not safe." Reed frowned. What happened here? Dr. Myers glanced nervously around the room. "It's SCP-008, the infection. It's spreading faster than we could contain it. We thought we had it under control, but..." He trailed off, his expression haunted. Reed felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of SCP-008, a highly contagious pathogen that turned people into mindless, violent creatures. If it had breached containment, they were all in grave danger. "We need to get to the communication room and call for backup," Reed said, standing up. "Can you lead the way?" Dr. Myers nodded, and together they left the control room. As they navigated the claustrophobic corridors, the sense of dread grew. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every creak of the floor a harbinger of doom. Reed couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. The facility, once a beacon of scientific achievement, had become a tomb, and the true horror was only just beginning. Frantic alarms blared through the facility as Dr. Alex Reed and Dr. Myers raced down the corridor. The lights overhead flickered, casting everything in an erratic, strobe-like glow. The once orderly research center was now a scene of pandemonium. "We have to seal the doors," Myers shouted over the noise, his voice edged with panic. "If we don't, the infection will spread." Reed nodded, his heart pounding. They reached the containment control room, and Myers immediately began typing furiously at a terminal. Reed watched as security feeds flashed across the monitors, showing scenes of chaos. Scientists and staff were running, some already displaying the grotesque signs of the infection. Their skin was pale, eyes vacant, movements jerky and unnatural. "Containment protocols failed," Myers muttered, his face pale. "We thought we had it under control, but it's mutated. It's more aggressive." A loud crash echoed down the hallway, followed by a series of guttural growls. Reed's blood ran cold. What was that? Myers glanced at the monitors, his expression grim. "They're coming. We need to move." They sprinted down the corridor, the relentless onslaught of alarms and growls growing louder. Reed could feel the harrowing escape closing in around them. The infected were fast, much faster than he had anticipated. The sound of footsteps and guttural noises echoed behind them, pushing them to run even faster. Suddenly, they burst into the main atrium. The large room, once a bustling hub of activity, was now filled with overturned furniture and broken equipment. The doors leading out of the facility were within sight, but so were the infected. Dozens of them, former colleagues now turned into mindless, ravenous creatures, lurched toward them. Reed's stomach churned at the sight. Blood and gore stained their lab coats, their eyes devoid of humanity. "We're not going to make it," Myers whispered. Fear etched into every line of his face. Reed grabbed a nearby metal rod, gripping it tightly. "We have to. Follow me." They moved cautiously, trying to avoid the infected. But one of the creatures spotted them, letting out a blood-curdling scream that drew the attention of the others. The infected charged, their movements erratic and terrifying. Reed swung the metal rod, connecting with the first infected's head. It went down, but two more took its place. Myers was struggling with another, trying to fend it off with his bare hands. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. "Go," Reed shouted, swinging the rod again. "Get to the doors." Myers broke free and dashed toward the exit, Reed close behind. They burst through the doors and into the courtyard, the nightmarish reality of their situation pressing in from all sides. The helicopter was still there, its rotors already spinning. They made a mad dash for it, the infected hot on their heels. Reed felt a sharp pain in his leg as one of the creatures grabbed him, its nails digging into his flesh. He kicked it away and kept running, the breath-stealing fear driving him forward. They reached the helicopter, and the pilot helped them inside. As the helicopter lifted off, Reed looked down at the facility. Fires had broken out, and the infected swarmed like ants, their bloodlust insatiable. Reed slumped back in his seat, trying to catch his breath. The harrowing escape was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. The infection was out, and the world had no idea what was coming. The helicopter set down in a clearing not far from the facility, surrounded by dense forest. Dr. Alex Reed and Dr. Myers hurried out, the wind from the rotors whipping around them. The pilot stayed behind, his face set in a grim mask. "We'll need to find help," Reed said, scanning the tree line. "The nearest town is miles away." Myers nodded, clutching his side where a large tear in his lab coat showed a nasty bruise. "We need to move quickly. They'll follow us." The two men set off into the forest, the eerie silence pressing in on them. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Reed jump. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the infected crashing through the underbrush. After what felt like hours, they reached a small, abandoned cabin. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but it was shelter. They went inside, barring the door as best they could. Reed moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. "Do you think they'll find us?" Myers shook his head, sitting down heavily on an old, dusty chair. "I don't know, but we need to rest. We can't keep going like this." Reed nodded, though he doubted he'd be able to sleep. He sank to the floor, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The events of the day played over in his mind, the alarms, the infected, the frantic escape. It all seemed unreal. Just as he was starting to doze off, a noise outside jolted him awake. It was a low, guttural growl, unmistakable in the silence of the night. Reed's heart pounded as he motioned for Myers to be quiet. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed into it. Reed grabbed a nearby piece of wood, ready to defend himself. The door burst open, and an infected lunged inside. Reed froze, staring at the grotesque transformation before him. The creature's skin was a sickly gray, its eyes empty and lifeless. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, snarling as it came toward them. With a surge of adrenaline, Reed swung the piece of wood, connecting with the creature's head. It staggered but didn't go down. Myers joined in, grabbing a metal pipe from the floor and striking the infected repeatedly. Finally, the creature collapsed, its body twitching before going still. Reed and Myers stood there, breathing heavily, the incomprehensible terror of what they had just faced sinking in. "We can't stay here," Myers said, his voice shaking. "They'll just keep coming." Reed nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We need to find help. Somewhere safer." They gathered what little supplies they could find and set out again into the night. The moonlight cast eerie shadows through the trees, and every noise set their nerves on edge. The vicious, ravenous creatures were out there, somewhere, and the blood-curdling screams they had heard earlier echoed in their minds. As they moved deeper into the forest, the spine-chilling presence of the infected seemed to follow them. Reed couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, that the nightmare they had escaped from was far from over. With each step, the terror grew, and the realization set in survival was just the beginning. The true horror lay ahead, in a world where the infected roamed free, and safety was an illusion. Dr. Alex Reed and Dr. Myers trudged through the dense forest, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that twisted and danced with every flicker of their flashlight. The relentless dread gnawed at Reed, making every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sound like a threat. "We need to find somewhere safe," Myers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere we can rest and come up with a plan." Reed nodded, scanning the dark forest. "There has to be something nearby. A house, a cabin, anything." After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old ranger station. It was small but sturdy, with metal shutters over the windows and a heavy wooden door. Reed pushed it open, and they hurried inside, barricading the door behind them. The interior was cramped, with dusty furniture and old maps on the walls. But it was safe, at least for now. Reed collapsed onto a battered sofa, his body aching. "We can't keep running forever," he said, rubbing his temples. "We need a plan."
Myers sat across from him, looking equally worn out. "We need to reach the nearest town. Warn people. Maybe they'll have resources, a way to contact the outside world."
Reed agreed, but the thought of navigating the claustrophobic corridors of the forest, teeming with infected, was terrifying. He glanced at the maps on the wall, trying to figure out their best route. "We'll take the back roads," he said finally. "Avoid the main paths. It'll be slower, but it should be safer." Myers nodded, and they spent the next few hours gathering supplies from the station: canned food, water, a first aid kit, and an old hunting rifle with a few rounds of ammunition. Reed tried to ignore the unrelenting dread that settled in his stomach. As dawn broke, they set out again. The forest was eerily quiet, the breath-stealing fear making every step feel like a risk. They moved cautiously, Reed holding the rifle ready. They hadn't gone far when they heard the unearthly growls of the infected. Reed signaled for Myers to stop, and they crouched behind a fallen tree. Through the dense underbrush, they could see a group of infected moving erratically, their heads jerking as they searched for prey. Reed's pulse pounded in his ears. "We have to go around them." Quietly. They crept through the forest, hearts racing, every noise amplified by their fear. The infected were relentless, but they managed to stay just out of sight. The tension was suffocating, the unrelenting dread threatening to overwhelm them. As they rounded a bend, they came face to face with one of the creatures. Reed didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The infected fell, but the noise attracted others. Growls and screams filled the air. "Run," Reed shouted, grabbing Myers' arm. They sprinted through the trees, the infected hot on their heels. The breath-stealing fear gave them speed, but the infected were fast too. Reed fired the rifle again, taking down another creature, but there were too many. They burst into a clearing and sought a road. An old, abandoned road, but a road nonetheless. They dashed across it and into the trees on the other side, the infected still chasing them. "We need to find a place to hide," Myers panted, glancing over his shoulder. Reed spotted a rocky outcrop and pointed. "There. We can climb up and maybe lose them." They scrambled up the rocks, the unrelenting dread driving them forward. At the top, they found a narrow ledge and squeezed into a crevice. The infected reached the base of the rocks, snarling and clawing, but unable to climb. Reed and Myers sat there, trying to catch their breath, the pulse-pounding tension finally easing. But the terror was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. They had survived another encounter, but the nightmare was far from over. "We need to keep moving," Reed said, his voice steady despite the fear. "We'll find the town. We'll warn them. We'll survive." Myers nodded, his eyes filled with grim determination. "We have to. There's no other choice." As they climbed down the rocks and continued their journey, the forest closed in around them, dark and foreboding. The desperate plan was their only hope, and they clung to it with every ounce of strength they had left. The forest grew denser as Dr. Alex Reed and Dr. Myers pushed onward, every step a struggle against the fatigue and fear weighing them down. The unrelenting dread was a constant companion, making every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs feel like a potential threat. "We need to find shelter soon," Reed said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "We can't keep this up." Myers nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I know, but where?" As if in answer, they stumbled upon a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin at its center. It looked abandoned, but it was their best option. They approached cautiously, Reed holding the rifle ready. Reed pushed the door open with a creak. The cabin was dark, filled with the smell of dust and decay. As they stepped inside, a shadow moved in the corner, and Reed swung the rifle around. "Wait," a voice called out. "Don't shoot." A woman stepped into the light, her hands raised. She looked as worn out as they did, her clothes dirty and torn. But her eyes were sharp, filled with a mix of fear and determination. "My name's Sarah," she said, her voice steady. "I've been hiding here since the outbreak started." Reed lowered the rifle slightly but kept it ready. "We're not infected, just trying to survive." Sarah nodded. "Same here. You're the first people I've seen in days. I thought I was alone." Reed glanced at Myers, who gave a slight nod. "We could use some help," Reed said. "We're trying to reach the nearest town to warn them." Sarah's eyes widened. "The infected are everywhere. It's not safe." "We know," Myers said. "But we have to try. Do you know the area?" Sarah nodded. "I grew up around here. I can help you get to the town, but we'll need to be careful. The infected are getting smarter, more organized." Reed felt a flicker of hope. An unexpected alliance could make all the difference. "We could use your help." "Thank you." They spent the night in the cabin, taking turns keeping watch. The narrow escapes and constant threat of danger made sleep difficult. Reed lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, the trust amid terror slowly building with their new ally. At dawn, they set out again. Sarah led the way, her knowledge of the forest proving invaluable. They moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the main paths and sticking to the shadows. The unrelenting dread was still there, but now it was tempered with a flicker of hope. As they navigated the forest, they encountered several narrow escapes. Each time, Sarah's instincts and quick thinking saved them. They began to trust her more, their bond strengthening with each encounter. During a brief rest, Sarah shared what she knew about the infected. "They're not just mindless monsters. They seem to be learning, adapting. We have to stay one step ahead. Reed nodded, the grim resolve in her voice matching his own. We'll make it. We have to. As they moved deeper into the forest, the terrain became more challenging. They climbed over fallen trees and waded through streams, the physical exertion taking its toll. But the flickering hope kept them going. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest. The town lay in the distance, a welcome sight after the relentless journey. But the sight that greeted them was not what they had hoped for. The town was overrun, the infected moving through the streets with a grim purpose. "We need to find a way in without being seen," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the area. "There's an old drainage tunnel that leads into the town. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Reed looked at Myers, who nodded. "Let's do it," Reed said, the flicker of hope burning brighter. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." They moved toward the drainage tunnel, the trust amid terror solidifying their resolve. Together, they would find a way to warn the town and survive. The unexpected alliance had given them a chance, and they weren't about to let it slip away. The drainage tunnel was cold and damp, the sound of dripping water echoing around them as Dr. Alex Reed, Dr. Myers, and Sarah made their way through the darkness. The flicker of their flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, adding to the insidious atmosphere. Reed's mind was racing with thoughts of what they might find in the town, but he pushed the fears aside, focusing on the task at hand. "We should be close," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady drip of water. "The tunnel leads to the old maintenance building. From there we can access the main streets." Reed nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Let's hope we find something useful. We need answers." The tunnel opened into a small, musty room filled with old equipment and rusted tools. They climbed out, carefully closing the hatch behind them. The maintenance building was deserted, but the insidious experiments that had led to the outbreak seemed to hang in the air, a malevolent presence that chilled Reed to the bone. "We need to find the records office," Reed said, scanning the building. "If there's any information on SCP-008, it'll be there." They moved cautiously through the building, the unsettling silence amplifying their tension. Finally, they reached a door marked Records. Reed pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The room was filled with filing cabinets and old computers, a treasure trove of forbidden knowledge. Myers began rifling through the cabinets while Reed powered up one of the computers. Sarah kept watch at the door, her eyes darting nervously around the room. After a few tense minutes, Myers let out a triumphant cry. "I found something," he said, holding up a file. "It's a report on the initial experiments with SCP-008. They were trying to develop a bioweapon." Reed's stomach churned as he read the file. The insidious experiments detailed in the report were horrifying. The researchers had knowingly exposed people to the virus, observing the grotesque transformations and the rapid spread of the infection. The shadowy conspiracies that had led to this nightmare were laid bare in black and white. "This is worse than I thought," Reed said, his voice shaking. "They didn't just lose control. They were playing with fire, and now we're all burning." Sarah's face was pale as she listened. "We have to get this information to the authorities. People need to know what really happened here." Reed nodded, but his mind was racing. The disturbing truths they had uncovered were only part of the story. There had to be more, deeper layers to the conspiracy. He turned back to the computer, searching through the files for anything else that might help them. Then he found it. A series of encrypted emails between high-ranking officials, discussing the potential use of SCP-008 as a weapon of war. The malevolent intent behind the outbreak was clear. This wasn't just an accident. It was a calculated act of madness. "They planned this," Reed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They wanted to see how the virus would spread, how effective it would be. This was a test run." Myers shook his head in disbelief. "We have to stop them." if this gets out. Reed didn't need him to finish the sentence. The consequences were too horrifying to contemplate. They had to get the information to someone who could help, someone who could stop the madness before it consumed everything. "We need to move," Sarah said, her voice tense. "The longer we stay here, the more danger we're in." Reed gathered the files and downloaded the emails onto a flash drive. "Let's go. We'll find a way to get this to the authorities." They left the records office, the insidious experiments and shadowy conspiracies they had uncovered fueling their determination. As they navigated the dark, deserted streets of the town, the disturbing truths they had learned weighed heavily on them. But they couldn't afford to dwell on it. There was too much at stake. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the infected. The town was overrun, but their grim resolve kept them going. They had to get the information out. They had to stop the spread of the virus. And as they made their way toward the outskirts of town, the malevolent intent behind the outbreak driving them forward, they knew one thing for certain: their fight was far from over. The true horror was still to come. The town was a nightmare come to life. Infected swarmed the streets, their grotesque forms moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Dr. Alex Reed, Dr. Myers, and Sarah moved cautiously through the shadows, their eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The weight of the disturbing truths they had uncovered pressed heavily on Reed's mind, but he pushed it aside. Survival was all that mattered now. "We're almost there," Sarah whispered, pointing to a building in the distance. "The old radio station. We can use it to call for help." Reed nodded, gripping the flash drive in his pocket. "Let's move quickly. We can't afford to be seen." They sprinted across the street, ducking into an alley just as a group of infected shuffled past. The heart-wrenching sacrifice they were about to make weighed heavily on them, but there was no other choice. They had to warn the world. They reached the radio station and slipped inside, barring the door behind them. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with old equipment and broken furniture. Reed quickly made his way to the broadcasting room, Myers and Sarah close behind. "Get the system online," Reed said, powering up the console. "We need to send the message now." Myers worked furiously at the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons. Sarah kept watch at the door, her face set in grim determination. The noble end they were striving for was within reach, but the danger was far from over. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building. Reed's heart sank as he turned to see the infected breaking through the windows. They had been discovered. "Keep them back," Reed shouted, grabbing a metal rod. "We need more time." Sarah and Myers joined the fight, using whatever they could find to hold off the infected. Reed worked frantically at the console, his hands shaking with fear and desperation. The agonizing farewell they were about to face felt inevitable. "We can't hold them off much longer," Sarah yelled, striking an infected with a chair. "Hurry." Reed finished typing the message and hit send. The console beeped, confirming the transmission. "It's done. We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The infected were pouring into the room, their eyes filled with a vicious, mindless hunger. Reed swung the metal rod, but there were too many. Myers was pulled down, his screams echoing through the room. "Go," Myers shouted, his voice filled with pain. "Get out of here. Save yourselves." Reed grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back door. They stumbled outside, the night air cold against their skin. Behind them, the radio station was overrun, Myers' final screams fading into silence. Sarah's eyes were filled with tears, but she nodded. "We have to keep moving. For Myers." They ran through the dark streets, the heart-wrenching sacrifice driving them forward. The infected were everywhere, but they managed to stay one step ahead, ducking into alleys and side streets. Finally, they reached the edge of town. The countryside stretched out before them, a vast expanse of darkness and uncertainty. But they couldn't stop now. The message had been sent. The world would know the truth. "We'll find help," Reed said, his voice filled with grim resolve. "We'll stop this." Sarah nodded, her face set in determination. For Myers. For everyone. As they made their way into the night, the noble end they sought seemed closer than ever. The heart-wrenching sacrifice had not been in vain. They would fight on, no matter the cost. The true horror was still to come, but they were ready to face it. Together they would survive. Together they would prevail. Dr. Alex Reed and Sarah reached the outskirts of the town, breathless and weary. The infected swarmed behind them, relentless in their pursuit. The countryside stretched out before them, offering no immediate refuge. Reed's mind raced, knowing they needed to make a final stand. "There's an old barn up ahead," Sarah said, pointing to a silhouette in the distance. "We can use it to buy some time." Reed nodded, his pulse pounding. "Let's go. We'll make our stand there." They sprinted toward the barn, the growls and screams of the infected echoing behind them. The barn was large, with heavy wooden doors and a loft that could give them a vantage point. They pushed the doors open and rushed inside, barring them with heavy beams. Reed looked around, searching for anything they could use as weapons. He found a pitchfork and handed it to Sarah, then grabbed a heavy wrench for himself. "We need to secure the upper level. It'll give us a better chance." They climbed the rickety ladder to the loft, the unrelenting dread making every creak sound like a death knell. From the loft, they could see the infected swarming around the barn, their eyes glowing with hunger. "Here they come," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear. The final confrontation was upon them. The infected began to break through the doors, their twisted bodies forcing their way inside. Reed swung the wrench, connecting with the first creature that climbed the ladder. It fell, but another took its place. "Keep them back," Reed shouted, his arms aching with the effort. "We can't let them up here." Sarah jabbed with the pitchfork, her movements precise and controlled. The relentless assault of the infected seemed never-ending, but they fought on, driven by unwavering courage. The narrow space of the loft worked to their advantage, funneling the infected into a manageable line. "We can't keep this up forever," Sarah said, panting. "We need a plan." Reed's mind raced. The desperate gambit had brought them this far, but they needed something more. "The fuel," he said suddenly. "There were barrels of fuel downstairs. If we can ignite it, we can take them all out." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll cover you. Go." Reed climbed down the ladder, his heart pounding. The infected swarmed below, but he moved quickly, grabbing a barrel of fuel and rolling it toward the center of the barn. He found an old lantern and smashed it against the barrel, the fuel igniting in a burst of flames. He climbed back to the loft, the heat from the fire scorching his skin. "It's done. Get ready to jump." They moved to the edge of the loft, the flames consuming the barn below. The infected howled in rage, their relentless assault turning into chaos as the fire spread. Reed and Sarah jumped, landing hard on the ground outside. They ran from the barn, the heat and smoke billowing behind them. The climactic showdown had left them battered and bruised, but they were alive. The infected were trapped in the inferno, their screams fading into the crackle of flames. Reed looked back at the burning barn, the final confrontation leaving him with a mix of relief and sorrow. The fight had cost them dearly, but they had survived. The desperate gambit had paid off. Sarah touched his arm, her expression fierce. "We did it, but we're not done yet." Reed nodded, the unwavering courage in her eyes matching his own. "No, we're not. We still have to get this information to the authorities. We have to stop this for good." They walked away from the burning barn, the night sky filled with the glow of the fire. The unrelenting dread was still there. but so was a flicker of hope. The true horror was still to come, but they were ready to face it. Together, they had made their final stand. Together, they would find a way to end the nightmare. Dr. Alex Reed and Sarah stood at the edge of the smoldering ruins of the barn, watching the flames die down. The haunting silence was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just survived. The infected were gone, consumed by the fire, but the scarred landscape around them told a grim story. "We need to move," Reed said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We have to reach the authorities." Sarah nodded, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "We can't let Meyer's sacrifice be in vain." They walked through the countryside, the sky lightening with the approaching dawn. The air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke, and the ground was littered with the debris of their battle. Reed's body ached with every step, but the lingering unease drove him forward. As they approached the town, they saw signs of the infection spread. Cars were abandoned on the streets, windows were shattered, and doors hung open, swaying in the breeze. The once bustling town was now a ghost town, a scarred landscape marked by the horrors that had taken place. "We need to find a working radio," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "There has to be a way to contact someone." They made their way to the town's police station, hoping it hadn't been overrun. The building stood silent and imposing, its front door ajar. They stepped inside, the unsettling quiet pressing down on them. Desks were overturned, papers scattered, and the smell of decay hung in the air. Reed found the radio room and began to search for any working equipment. Sarah kept watch at the door, her nerves on edge. After a few tense moments, Reed managed to get the radio working, the static filling the room with an almost comforting hum. "This is Dr. Alex Reed," he said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the fear. "We've discovered the source of the outbreak. We need immediate assistance." There was a crackle of static, then a voice responded. "Dr. Reed, this is command. We've been receiving reports of outbreaks. Your information is critical. What's your location?" Reed quickly gave their coordinates, the sense of urgency in his voice unmistakable. "We have evidence of a deliberate release of the virus. We need to get it to you." "Understood," the voice replied. "Help is on the way. Hold your position." Reed set down the microphone, a wave of relief washing over him. "They're sending help. We just need to hold on a little longer." Sarah smiled, but her eyes were filled with lingering unease. "We've made it this far. We can do this." They barricaded themselves in the radio room, waiting for the promised help to arrive. The haunting silence was broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio and the distant sounds of the infected roaming the streets. Reed couldn't shake the feeling that the infection might not be entirely eradicated, that the true horror was still out there, lurking. Hours passed, and the sound of helicopters approaching filled the air. Reed and Sarah stepped outside, shielding their eyes against the bright sunlight. A squad of soldiers descended, their faces set in grim determination. "Dr. Reed?" Sarah, the lead soldier, asked, his voice steady. "We're here to secure the area and get you to safety." Reed nodded, the weight of the past day's events pressing down on him. "We have the evidence you need. It's all here." As they were escorted to the helicopters, Reed looked back at the scarred landscape of the town. The infection had taken so much, but they had survived. The lingering unease would stay with him, but so would the knowledge that they had made a difference. Sarah touched his arm, her expression filled with hope. "We did it, Alex. We made it." Reed smiled, the haunting silence finally giving way to a sense of peace. "Yeah, we did. And we'll keep fighting, no matter what comes next." As the helicopters lifted off, carrying them away from the scarred landscape, Reed knew that their battle was far from over. But for the first time he felt a flicker of hope, that they could overcome the true horror that still lay ahead. Together they would face whatever came next, ready to fight for a future free from the nightmare of SCP-008. Dr. Alex, Reed, and Sarah stood in the bustling command center, a stark contrast to the horror and chaos they had endured. The room was filled with the hum of computers, the murmur of voices, and the steady rhythm of purposeful activity. It was a place of order and resolve, a beacon of hope amid the uncertainty. "We have to ensure this never happens again," Reed said, his voice resolute. "We've seen what SCP-008 can do. We can't let it spread any further." Sarah nodded, her face set with the same determined look. "We need to track down every trace of the virus, every hidden lab, every rogue element that might use it. It's the only way to make sure the world is safe." Their determination was mirrored by the others in the command center. Scientists, soldiers, and strategists worked together, their renewed purpose clear. Reed felt a surge of resolve, knowing they were part of something bigger, something crucial. Reed and Sarah were assigned to a special task force dedicated to neutralizing SCP-008. Their mission tracked down and eliminate any remaining threats. They were given access to the latest technology, resources, and a dedicated team of experts. "We'll start with the known locations," Reed said, pointing to a map filled with red dots. "These are the labs and facilities we've identified so far. We need to secure and decontaminate each one." Sarah leaned in, her finger tracing a path across the map. "And we need to follow up on any leads, any rumors of outbreaks or sightings. We can't leave anything to chance." Their first target was a remote lab in the mountains, suspected of housing remnants of the virus. The journey there was tense, the uncertainty of what they might find weighing on them. But the resolute determination kept them focused. The lab was hidden, accessible only by a narrow, winding road. As they approached, Reed felt the familiar flicker of unease, but he pushed it aside. They had a job to do. Inside, the lab was a stark reminder of the past horrors. Broken equipment, scattered papers, and the lingering smell of chemicals. Reed and Sarah moved methodically, searching for any signs of the virus. "We have to be thorough," Reed said, scanning a row of test tubes. "We can't afford to miss anything." Hours later, they emerged from the lab, their grim resolve unwavering. They had found traces of SCP-008, but they had also secured and neutralized it. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As they continued their mission, the narrow escapes and tense encounters became routine. Each success brought a flicker of hope, each setback only fueled their determination. They were fighting for a future, for a world free from the shadow of SCP-008. Reed and Sarah worked tirelessly, their bond strengthening with each mission. They trusted each other completely, their shared purpose driving them forward. The renewed purpose was more than just a mission, it was a promise to the world, to the people they had lost, and to themselves. Months passed, and the list of known locations grew shorter. The task force's efforts were paying off. The once grim outlook began to brighten, the uncertain future becoming clearer. One evening, as they reviewed their progress, Sarah turned to Reed, her eyes reflecting the same hope he felt. "We're making a difference, Alex. We're really doing it." Reed smiled, the weight of the past lifting just a little. "Yeah, we are, and we'll keep going until it's done." Their fight was far from over, but the new beginning was within reach. They had faced the true horror and emerged stronger, more determined. Together they would continue to track down and neutralize SCP-008, ensuring a safer future for everyone. As the sun set on another day, Reed and Sarah stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The renewed purpose and unwavering courage would guide them, and the flicker of hope would light their way. Together they would build a new beginning, one step at a time.